He laughed while the room cheered for him. My husband, standing under golden lights, champagne in hand, looked me dead in the eyes and said my greatest achievement was folding laundry on time. They all laughed, every single one. What he didn't know was that I owned 56% of the company that paid their salaries, and before that night was over, I'd fire him in front of them all. Before we dive in, thank you for being here. If you've ever been underestimated, ignored, or told to know your place, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for every person who's been laughed at right before they took everything back. The Silverstone Grill wasn't just a restaurant, it was a statement. Polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers that shimmered like icicles, and waiters who spoke in tones that suggested they were guarding national secrets. It was the kind of place my husband Julian loved. Expensive enough to feed his ego, loud enough for everyone to hear him when he bragged. That night was supposed to be a celebration. Julian had just been named top salesperson at his father's company, Peton Technologies. He'd been basking in it all week, repeating the phrase like it was a sacred title. He was at the head of the table, glass raised high, the spotlight catching his smile just so. Around him sat his father, Richard, CEO and self-appointed patriarch of everything he touched, plus his colleagues, Chelsea from HR, Marcus from operations, Connor from sales. They laughed at every word he said, every carefully rehearsed story about how hard work always pays off. I knew that line by heart. I'd heard it 1,000 times. He loved the sound of it, as if saying it could erase the fact that he was where he was because of his last name. Julian had just finished thanking everyone, his father, his team, the company, when he turned to me. And that's when everything inside me went still. And of course, he said, voice dripping with confidence, I need to thank my wife, Violet. He smiled. She's mastered all the traditional domestic skills. The house is always spotless, my dry cleaning never late. She really knows her place. The table erupted. Laughter bounced off the walls, a chorus of privilege disguised as humor. Richard slapped the table so hard the wine glasses rattled. Chelsea covered her mouth, trying to look polite, but her shoulders were shaking with laughter. Even the couple at the next table looked over, smiling, entertained by the spectacle of a man publicly mocking his wife. My face burned, but I didn't move. I'd learned long ago that reacting only fed him more attention. I smiled politely, the kind of smile women master when they're trying not to shatter. Come on, Vi, Julian said, reaching over to pat my hand. Don't be mad, it's just a joke. Maybe you'll learn something tonight watching a real professional at work. He winked, and I realized this wasn't just about ego anymore. This was about erasure. They saw me as decoration, the wife, the background noise to their success. None of them knew that inside my handbag was an envelope, one that carried the power to rewrite the entire hierarchy of that table. Inside were the documents proving that I, Violet Peton, owned 56% of Peton Technologies, that I wasn't just the wife of the top salesperson, I was the majority shareholder of the entire company. I took a slow sip of my wine, and I waited. The truth is, the story didn't start that night. It started 18 months earlier, the day I realized what kind of man I'd married. When Julian and I met, I was just wrapping up the sale of my data analytics company, a quiet success story that had taken 5 years and more sleepless nights than I could count. I'd co-founded it with a friend from college. We built systems that corporate giants relied on but never thought about, invisible architecture that made their operations run. When the buyout offer came, it was generous, enough that I could have retired comfortably before I turned 33. But I wasn't built to retire. I liked solving problems too much. Julian never asked about the deal. He smiled, said, "That's cute," and launched into a 20-minute story about his father's latest acquisition. That should have been my first warning. He didn't marry me because he loved who I was. He married the idea of me, the quiet, composed woman who'd look good on his arm at corporate galas. At first, I tried to fit the role. At company dinners, I smiled, nodded, asked the right questions. No one ever asked me about my work, not once, because Julian introduced me like this. This is Violet, my wife. She's incredible at keeping me organized. And that's all they needed to know. Over time, I became quieter, smaller. I learned when to laugh, when to listen, when to disappear, until invisibility became second nature. But here's the thing about invisibility. If you learn to control it, it becomes power. Because while they ignored me, I was watching, learning, mapping the company's internal ecosystem like a battlefield. And when Richard, the great Richard Peton, came to me one evening, sweating through his expensive shirt, desperate because his company was drowning in debt. I saw the opening I'd been waiting for. That's when the real story began. That Tuesday night, I remember the smell of Richard's cigars lingering in the air long before I entered his study. The family dinners were always rehearsed performances, the men talking numbers, the women smiling politely. But that night felt different. Richard wasn't holding court. He was pacing. His hands trembled when he poured his drink. "Violet," he said, closing the door behind me. "I need your help." Those words, "I need your help," coming from a man who'd once said I should leave business to people who understood it, felt almost surreal. He launched into it, the temporary liquidity challenge, as he called it. Translation: he'd blown $17 million of company money on metaverse real estate, NFTs, and a cryptocurrency backed by theoretical carbon credits. The words temporary and challenge were corporate camouflage for disaster. He needed capital, fast, quietly, no board involvement, no public panic, no headlines. He wanted a lifeline. He wanted me. I didn't interrupt him. I just listened to the shaking in his voice, the way his hand clenched the glass like it might steady his ego. For the first time, Richard looked small, human. And I felt something unfamiliar stirring inside me. Not pity, power. When he finally stopped talking, I took a slow breath and said, "If I help, I'll need full transparency, and my attorney will review every document." He nodded too quickly. Of course, whatever it takes." But what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I'd already made my decision the moment he asked. If I was going to save his company, I wasn't doing it as his daughter-in-law, I was doing it as an owner. The next morning, I called Lauren Hastings, the attorney who'd handled the sale of my analytics firm. Lauren didn't waste time with small talk. "Do you want to be a passive investor?" she asked, "or do you want control?" The question hung in the air. I stared at the city skyline outside my window, all glass and reflection, and I thought about 18 months of being ignored, laughed at, patronized. "Control," I said. That one word, calm, deliberate, was the moment I stopped being invisible. Over the next 3 weeks, Lauren worked like a surgeon. She constructed a web of holding companies, trusts, and intermediaries so intricate that even Richard's accountants wouldn't be able to trace the true ownership. On paper, it looked like a standard capital rescue. In reality, it gave me 56% of Piton Technologies and total decision-making power over its future. Richard signed everything in his desperation. He didn't even read the fine print. He just thanked me, with that brittle smile men use when they think they're still in control. Julian, of course, knew nothing. Richard said it was to protect him from stress. I knew better. He was ashamed. So for the next year and a half, I played my part. The quiet wife who didn't ask too many questions. The same woman who kept his world polished while quietly becoming the one who owned it. But invisibility, even when it's strategic, it's heavy. Some nights I'd sit awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd become a ghost in my own marriage. Julian would be beside me, asleep, dreaming about his own greatness. He'd never once asked what I was thinking, what I wanted. He didn't know that while he bragged about his big wins, I was signing off on board approvals that made them possible. He didn't realize the company's survival, his success, existed because of my money, my strategy, my control. Every deal he celebrated was one I'd indirectly authorized. Every paycheck he cashed was written from the company I owned. And the irony was almost poetic. Then came the promotion. Top salesperson of the quarter. Julian burst into our house that evening like a man who'd just conquered the world. He was practically glowing. "I did it, Vi. Beat everyone by a landslide. Silverstone Grill this weekend. My treat. We'll celebrate with the team." He texted the whole group. His father, his colleagues, his little circle of enablers. Before I even responded, I watched him pace, rehearsing his speech in the hallway mirror. He practiced pauses, gestures, the humble laugh that wasn't humble at all. He even handed me a printed list of safe conversation topics for the dinner. "Stick to these," he said, as if he were briefing a secretary. "Compliment Chelsea's jewelry. Don't talk about business. It's complicated. I don't want you to feel out of your depth." I stared at him. This man who'd never read a single report in his life without Richard's help, and realized that my silence had become his comfort zone. He believed it was proof of his superiority. That was when I made my decision. Saturday night, Silverstone Grill. That would be the night I stopped pretending. Lauren had everything ready by Friday afternoon. The legal documents, the ownership proof, the termination letter, all tucked neatly inside a sealed envelope delivered to my door by her assistant while Julian was out getting a haircut. I held it in my hands that night, feeling its weight, knowing it wasn't just paper. It was justice. 18 months of quiet endurance condensed into a single moment of reckoning. Saturday came. Julian looked immaculate. Tailored suit, silk tie, the perfect image of success. He smiled at me in the mirror. "You look great, Vi. Just remember this is my night, okay? Don't overdo it." I smiled back. "Wouldn't dream of it." At the restaurant, the champagne flowed before we even sat down. Richard was already boasting about the Piton legacy. Chelsea giggled at every quip. Marcus nodded like an obedient courtier. And I watched, quietly, patiently, because I knew what they didn't. That envelope sat in my handbag like a heartbeat. Julian's speech began the way it always did. Gratitude, charisma, humble bragging masked as sincerity. And then, that line, the one that turned laughter into daggers. Her biggest achievement is probably folding laundry on time. The laughter exploded, and I felt everything inside me go cold. That was the moment the waiting ended, because if they thought my silence meant submission, they were about to learn what real control sounded like. Julian's laughter echoed through the restaurant like crystal shattering, and the moment he said it, "She married me for money," something inside me finally clicked. 18 months of quiet observation, of playing the role they expected. It all condensed into a single, razor-sharp thought. You have no idea what's coming. He was still smiling when I reached into my handbag, still basking in the adoration of people who laughed, not because the joke was funny, but because it was safe. Because laughing meant staying on the right side of power. What none of them knew was that power had just shifted. The envelope was warm in my hand. I'd carried it all evening, feeling the weight of it grow heavier with each condescending laugh. I didn't interrupt him right away. I let him finish his little performance. I let him say every stupid word he'd prepared, every line rehearsed in the mirror. And when he reached that inevitable moment, the punchline that made the room erupt, I smiled. Calmly, deliberately. "You're right," I said softly. "Jokes are fun. Want to hear mine?" The table froze. The laughter died in their throats. Julian blinked, caught off guard by my tone. Light, almost pleasant. But my voice carried something new, something he'd never heard before. Power. I'd spent 18 months preparing for this. Not consciously at first, not like a revenge plan with blueprints and dates. It began as survival, observation, learning how their world worked. While Julian bragged, I studied. While Richard lectured, I listened to what he said, and more importantly, to what he didn't. I learned how decisions moved through Piton technologies, how influence flowed like current beneath polished boardroom tables. Richard believed he was grooming his son to inherit an empire. What he didn't know was that his empire was already mine. I still remember the day Lauren handed me the final signed documents. We were sitting in her office, the late afternoon sun bleeding across stacks of paper. "Once he signs these," she said, "you'll have full authority. Every decision, every board vote, every executive contract, all of it runs through you." I remember tracing my finger along the signature line, Richard Piton, and feeling the faintest tremor of disbelief. He'd actually done it. He'd signed away control to the one person he'd never taken seriously. "You understand what this means," Lauren said. "You could remove them both tomorrow if you wanted." I'd smiled then. Tomorrow's too soon. Because patience, that was the key. If I moved too early, they'd call it manipulation. If I waited long enough, they'd hand me the perfect reason themselves. And they did. Every sexist comment, every public joke, every time Julian introduced me as just his wife, every time Richard talked over me at dinner or called me sweetheart in meetings like I was a secretary, they were writing my justification in real time. And now, at the Silverstone grill, with the candlelight glinting off my wine glass and Julian's voice still echoing in the air. I knew the timing was perfect. I placed the envelope on the table. The sound of it sliding across the white linen was louder than it should have been. "What's this?" Julian asked, still half laughing, half confused. "Open it," I said. He hesitated, like some part of him already knew the punchline wasn't his this time. When he tore the flap open, the air at the table seemed to change. The laughter evaporated. All that was left was silence. He scanned the first page, and I watched his eyes widen, his lips part just slightly. Then came the frown, the disbelief, the slow, dawning comprehension. The color drained from his face. His hand started to shake, and I said calmly, clearly, "I own 56% of Piton Technologies." The words hit like a gunshot, which means, I continued, that I own this company, your father's company, and effective immediately, Julian, you're fired. Every sound in the restaurant vanished. The laughter that had filled the air seconds ago dissolved into absolute crystalline silence. Richard froze mid-reach, his hand hovering above his wine glass. Chelsea's eyes went wide, the shock turning her giggle into a strangled gasp. Marcus looked between us like someone trying to wake up from a dream. Even the couple at the next table had gone utterly still. Julian just stared, his mouth opening but no words forming. You could almost hear his world collapsing in real time. 18 months of arrogance, of mockery, of blind entitlement, crumbling. And in its place, the unbearable truth. His success, his stability, his career, all of it had been built on my money, my strategy, my silence. Richard recovered first, of course. He always did. He lunged across the table, snatched the papers from Julian's hand, and started flipping through them with trembling fingers. "This is impossible," he muttered. "You can't. We had an agreement. You were supposed to be a passive investor." I smiled. "I said I wasn't interested in day-to-day management, Richard. I never said I'd surrender control." He looked up, his face pale, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You tricked me." "No," I said. "You underestimated me." Julian finally found his voice, small, broken. "You told me you were doing consulting work, advisory stuff. You never asked," I interrupted. "You were too busy explaining your greatness to notice the foundation you were standing on belonged to me." The silence stretched. Even the waiters had stopped moving. "This has nothing to do with tonight's joke," I said, standing. "This is about accountability. Nepotism and mediocrity have run this company long enough. That ends now." I turned toward the table, the same people who'd laughed at me moments earlier. "Julian's position is terminated effective immediately. Someone from HR will contact him Monday about severance and benefits." No one spoke. No one moved. So I smiled. "Thank you for dinner. The steak was excellent." Then I walked out. The cold air hit me as I stepped onto the sidewalk. For the first time in months, I could breathe. Behind me, chaos. Voices rising, chairs scraping, panic replacing laughter. Through the glass, I could see Julian standing, phone in hand, face white as paper, Richard shouting, Chelsea crying, and me, walking away, calm, deliberate, unstoppable. That was the moment the tables finally turned, literally and figuratively. By the time I got home, I had 37 missed calls. Julian, Richard, unknown numbers. My phone buzzed like it was alive. I made tea instead, sat in the quiet kitchen, let the silence feel like freedom. When I finally checked my voicemail, Julian's voice came through first. Shaky, frantic, angry. "You've destroyed everything. My career, my reputation, my relationship with my father. How could you do this, Violet? What kind of wife does that over a joke?" I deleted it, because this wasn't about a joke. It was about 18 months of erasure, and one woman finally deciding to be seen. That night, I slept better than I had in years, because for the first time, I didn't dream of being understood. I dreamt of being free. The morning after the dinner, my phone rang nonstop. News travels fast in corporate circles, faster when humiliation is involved. By 9 a.m., half the company knew that Julian Piton, top salesman of the quarter, had been fired by his own wife. By noon, it wasn't just gossip, it was legend. I didn't pick up a single call. Instead, I walked into Piton Technologies headquarters for the first time not as Mrs. Piton, but as majority shareholder, Violet Piton. The receptionist, the same woman who used to greet me with patronizing smiles, stood when she saw me. Her expression flickered between confusion and fear. "Good morning, Ms. Piton," I corrected gently. "There's no Mrs. anymore." The elevator ride to the 18th floor was long and quiet. I could feel eyes on me when the doors opened, whispers rippling down the hallway like a current. In the conference room, the board was already waiting. Richard was there too, red-eyed and trembling with restrained fury. "Violet," he started, this spectacle last night wasn't a spectacle," I said, setting my files on the table. "It was an overdue correction." He leaned forward. "You've embarrassed this family. Do you have any idea how the shareholders will react?" I smiled. "They'll react favorably, considering I am the majority shareholder, and the other 44% are about to receive dividends for the first time in 3 years, courtesy of the restructuring plan I'm implementing today." A murmur rippled through the room. Richard blinked. "Restructuring?" "Yes," I said. "Effective immediately. We'll be dissolving unnecessary executive redundancies, eliminating nepotistic contracts, and transitioning to a merit-based leadership structure, including your sons." Someone coughed. Another board member looked down at the table. No one defended him. Not one. Julian wasn't there. He hadn't been seen since the dinner. The following week was chaos. Reporters camped outside our building. The headline on Bloomberg Tech Weekly read, "Silent partner no more. Woman secretly buys majority stake, fires husband and father-in-law." Every outlet wanted an interview. I declined them all. At least at first. Silence was my language. Let them talk. Let them wonder. I had nothing to prove. Julian tried to call again. Voicemails that shifted from anger to pleading to something dangerously close to regret. But there's a difference between regret and accountability. He never said I'm sorry. He just said I want my life back. By the end of that month, divorce papers were filed. He didn't contest them. I gave him enough to start over, not enough to rebuild the pedestal he once stood on. Richard resigned 2 weeks later. The press release was polite, retiring to focus on family. But inside the company, everyone knew it wasn't retirement, it was exile. People always imagine revenge as fire, loud, destructive, blazing through everything in its path. But mine wasn't fire, it was frost, quiet, controlled, the kind of cold that freezes arrogance mid-laugh. There was no screaming, no chaos, just stillness. That was the beauty of it. Silence reclaimed from years of being silenced. In those first few weeks as CEO, I made decisions that mattered. We restructured wages, promoted people who had been overlooked because they didn't have the right last name. For the first time, talent was rewarded instead of entitlement. And every time I walked past the boardroom table, the one where Julian once bragged about his big wins, I could still hear echoes of that laughter. Only now, it didn't hurt. It reminded me who I'd become. One evening, about a month after everything, I was working late. The office was empty, the city glowing below me. Silver, alive, distant. The intercom buzzed. The receptionist's voice came through softly. "Miss Piton, there's someone here to see you." I knew who before she said his name. "Julian." I let him in. He looked smaller, thinner, like life had drained some of his brightness. But his arrogance, that quiet hum beneath his words, was still there. "You really did it," he said, forcing a laugh. "You won." I leaned back, studying him. It wasn't a competition. "Oh, come on. That's all it ever was." He looked around the office, eyes scanning the view, the awards, the subtle signs of power. Then he sighed. "I never thought you had it in you." "That's exactly why you lost." He chuckled, bitter, hollow. "So this is it? You get everything, and I walk away a joke?" "You made yourself the joke," I said quietly. "You wrote the punchline." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You know, for what it's worth, you were always smarter than me." He turned to leave, and just before the door closed, he said, without looking back, "I never should have laughed." The door clicked shut, and that, finally, was closure. Revenge doesn't heal you. It doesn't erase the sleepless nights or the sting of humiliation, but it gives you something rare. Silence on your own terms. That night, I stood by the window, looking down at the city that had once made me feel small. I thought about the girl who used to rehearse smiles at company dinners, the woman who sat through jokes about knowing her place. She didn't disappear. She evolved. Because sometimes to reclaim your power, you have to let them underestimate you. You let them laugh. You let them talk. And then, when the time is right, you remind them why silence is dangerous. I still visit Silverstone Grill sometimes. The same table, the same candlelight, the same gleaming marble floor. But now, when I sit there, the waiters call me by name. They don't see a wife sitting quietly beside a man. They see the woman who bought the table. They say revenge is best served cold. But I've learned it's not about temperature. It's about timing. It's about patience, precision, and knowing when to walk away. Because real power doesn't come from destroying someone. It comes from rebuilding yourself in full view of everyone who once doubted you, and smiling while they watch. I didn't just fire my husband that night. I fired the version of myself that believed silence was safety. And in doing so, I finally heard my own voice again. If you've ever been underestimated, mocked, or told you didn't belong, remember Violet's story. Patience isn't weakness, it's strategy. Hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if someone laughed at your worth in front of the world? Because sometimes, silence is the loudest revenge of all.